The heavy steel doors shuddered open, a grinding scrape that echoed through the long, empty corridor. Samuel Price stepped into the pale light of morning, his first taste of freedom in 15 years. The air outside the gate was cold and sharp, carrying a hint of rain. He stood for a long moment, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was finally free. But the price had been everything. They had called him unstable, dangerous, a threat to society. They had thrown him into a psychiatric institution and slammed the door behind him. Inside those sterile walls, he had been drugged, restrained, and broken down. He had pleaded his innocence until his voice cracked, until the words lost meaning. The crime he had been accused of, murdering his own sister, Rachel, was a grotesque lie. But the evidence was stacked, the witnesses sure, the prosecutors relentless. The real killers had sat smug in their suits, their faces unmarked by guilt, knowing they had won. In the institution, Samuel had learned the true meaning of torment: solitary confinement for weeks, forced medication that blurred the edges of his mind, the sharp bite of restraints on his wrists and ankles, mocking whispers from the staff who treated him like an animal. They said he was violent, but it was them who had twisted his world into a nightmare. 15 years. When the new evidence came to light, a misplaced forensic report, a hidden confession from a dying man, Samuel's name was finally cleared. They released him without apology, without acknowledgement of the years stolen from him. The world had moved on, but Samuel hadn't. He left the institution with nothing but a set of clothes and a cold rage that burned like acid through his veins. For the next months, he lived in silence, a rented apartment in a forgotten part of town, a burner phone, a wall covered in notes and photographs. He retraced the steps that had led to his imprisonment, piecing together the conspiracy. The witnesses, the detectives, the prosecutors, they had all played a part. Some had done it for money, others for ambition, and some just for the thrill of destroying a life. Samuel didn't plan to simply kill them. Death would be too quick, too easy. They needed to suffer, to feel the same helpless terror he had endured, to taste the cold metal of restraints, the bite of drugs coursing through their veins, the suffocating weight of silence and isolation. He started with Dennis Clark, the lead detective who had built the case against him. Samuel watched him for weeks, learning his patterns. Dennis lived in a neat suburban home with a wife and 2 teenage kids. He jogged in the mornings, worked late at the precinct, and liked to unwind with a few drinks before bed. One night, Samuel slipped into Dennis's home while he slept. He moved through the dark like a shadow, disabling the alarms, cutting the phone lines. When Dennis woke, it was to the taste of cloth shoved into his mouth and the burn of plastic cuffs digging into his wrists. Samuel stood over him, his face calm, his eyes gleaming with quiet malice. He didn't speak, not yet. He took Dennis to an abandoned building on the edge of town, a place that had once been a hospital but was now nothing more than rotting walls and broken glass. There, Samuel recreated his own torment. He strapped Dennis to a stained mattress, injected him with a cocktail of sedatives and stimulants, and left him in a windowless room for days. Food was sparse, water contaminated, lights flickered at random intervals, disorienting him. Recordings played in the background, Samuel's own screams from the institution, the voices of orderlies mocking him, the grinding of locks. When Dennis's mind began to crack, when he babbled apologies and begged for release, Samuel finally entered the room. He leaned close, his breath hot against Dennis's ear, and whispered every detail of the detective's betrayal. Then, with a surgical calmness, he ended Dennis's life. His body was found a week later, posed like a discarded doll, his eyes wide and glassy. Authorities whispered about drugs and mental breakdowns, but no one connected the death to Samuel Price. The next target was Linda Monroe, the forensic analyst who had falsified the lab reports. Samuel watched her for months, mapping her routines, her weaknesses. He followed her to her gym, her grocery store, her weekend retreats. When he struck, it was with precision. He abducted her in the parking garage late one night, slipping a needle into her neck before she could scream. Linda awoke in a soundproofed room, strapped to a chair under a blinding light. Samuel made sure she saw him. He made sure she remembered the reports she had doctored, the lies she had told, the evidence she had twisted to destroy his life. Then he recreated her crimes. He forced her to falsify reports under duress, watching as her hands trembled and her mind unraveled. When her will finally broke, he made her read her confession aloud, recording every word. Her body was found dumped in a river, her wrists slit, her face frozen in an expression of pure terror. Samuel's list was long. Prosecutors, witnesses, even the smug attorney who had laughed in his face during his trial. Each would face their own nightmare. Each would experience a carefully crafted echo of what they had inflicted on him. And Samuel? He would remain a ghost in the shadows, methodical, relentless, a hand of vengeance that no one saw coming. He was just getting started. After Linda Monroe's body was found, whispers echoed through the city's legal circles. 2 deaths connected to the same old case? The papers speculated, but law enforcement dismissed the idea. Coincidence, an overdose, a suicide. They didn't see the pattern, because Samuel didn't leave one they could trace. He worked in the shadows, studying the lives of his targets, building his revenge like an architect designs a trap. His next target was Alan Bishop, the smug, silver-tongued prosecutor who had turned the jury against him with polished lies and manufactured evidence. Samuel remembered the man's voice vividly, the way he'd called him unstable, a danger to society, as if Samuel were some rabid animal needing to be put down. Alan lived alone in a high-rise downtown, his nights filled with expensive scotch and one-night stands. Samuel watched from across the street, blending into crowds, waiting for the perfect moment. When Alan staggered home from a bar one night, Samuel was already waiting in his apartment. Alan's eyes widened with recognition when he saw the figure in the shadows, but before he could speak, Samuel's fist connected with his throat. The prosecutor crumpled, gasping, and Samuel bound him tightly. He didn't kill Alan right away. That would be too merciful. Instead, he recreated the suffocating helplessness he'd felt in the institution. Alan awoke strapped to a gurney in a cold, sterile room, IV lines snaking into his veins, a feeding tube forcing sustenance into his stomach. Samuel controlled the lights, the sounds. He played endless loops of courtroom footage, Alan's own voice delivering damning statements, the jeers of the courtroom audience. Days passed. Alan wept, raged, pleaded, his voice cracking into hoarse sobs. Only then, when Samuel saw the light break in his eyes, did he step into view. He described the prosecutor's role in framing him, recounting every lie, every twisted word. Then, with a precision learned through years of silent rage, Samuel silenced him forever. Alan's body was discovered hanging from a hook in an abandoned warehouse, dressed in the same suit he'd worn during Samuel's trial. The media speculated about depression, but there were no answers. No suspects. By now, rumors of a silent predator rippled through the legal and law enforcement communities. Whispers of fear. A few tried to tighten security, to carry guns, to move in pairs, but Samuel was always a step ahead. His next target was Kendra Hale, one of the witnesses who had perjured herself on the stand. Kendra had been a friend of his sister, someone who should have spoken the truth, but instead chose the easy lie, testifying that she'd seen Samuel leaving Rachel's apartment covered in blood. Kendra thought she was safe, living in a gated community, working from home, her world insulated by wealth, but Samuel was patient. He slipped past security cameras, disabled alarms, and waited until she was alone. She awoke in her own home, bound to a chair in her opulent living room. Mirrors surrounded her, reflecting her terrified face from every angle. Samuel forced her to watch video clips of herself testifying against him, playing them on loop as he whispered the truth she had buried. He forced her to write out her perjury, her reasons, her confessions, again and again, her hands shaking as ink smeared across the paper. When she begged for her life, Samuel only stared at her, his expression cold and detached. When he ended her, it was with a quiet precision, leaving her surrounded by mirrors, each one reflecting her final terror. By this time, police couldn't ignore the pattern. They recognized the old case resurfacing, but they had no leads. Samuel was a ghost, leaving no fingerprints, no witnesses, no trace. His face was different now, beard grown in, hair dyed, posture altered. He was invisible to the world that had once consumed him. He kept a meticulous list. The final name was Thomas Reed, the psychologist who had signed off on his committal, declaring him a danger to himself and others. Thomas had profited handsomely from his testimony, earning media appearances and a lucrative book deal about the volatile mind of Samuel Price. Samuel found him living in a secluded estate outside the city, protected by high walls and private security. But walls didn't stop Samuel. He learned the schedules, the guard rotations, the vulnerabilities. One rainy night, he slipped into the estate, bypassing the alarms and catching Thomas in his study. He didn't bind him immediately. Instead, he spoke, his voice low and measured. He described the years stolen from him, the nights spent screaming into a padded cell, the drug-induced stupors, the moments when he nearly lost his mind. Thomas stammered, tried to deny responsibility, but Samuel cut him off with a calm, venomous whisper. "I'm going to show you what it feels like." He incapacitated Thomas with a precise injection and transported him to an abandoned psychiatric wing Samuel had discovered during his months of planning. He recreated the institution's horrors, the restraints, the sedatives, the blinding lights, the endless echoes of recorded voices mocking him. For days, Thomas was left in a state of drugged confusion, his mind shattering under the weight of fear and isolation. When Samuel returned, he didn't offer explanations. He simply watched Thomas crumble into a whimpering shell of a man. Then, with a final act of cold justice, he ended his life, leaving his body posed in a straitjacket, a mirror reflecting his hollow face. The news was a frenzy. An unknown hand was eliminating the players behind the infamous case of Samuel Price, but no one knew where he was. No one even knew if he was alive. And Samuel? He moved through the city's underbelly like a phantom, his work methodical, his rage finally given voice. He was far from done. The city was on edge. Each gruesome death struck like a thunderclap, a reminder that someone was out there, a specter stalking the guilty. Police poured resources into the investigation, but the trail was cold. The remaining names on Samuel's list tried to bury their guilt under security systems and private bodyguards, but none of it mattered. They didn't understand that Samuel wasn't just hunting them, he was dismantling the walls they thought could protect them. Next was Howard Beck, a retired judge who had presided over Samuel's trial. Howard had smiled as he delivered the verdict, his gavel falling like the hammer of a god. Samuel remembered the gleam of satisfaction in the man's eyes as he condemned him. It wasn't justice, it was performance. The media had eaten it up, and Howard had basked in the spotlight. Howard now lived in a secluded mansion, surrounded by tall hedges and stone walls. Samuel studied the estate for weeks, learning the security's patterns. On a fog-shrouded night, he breached the perimeter, slipping into the judge's home. He waited until Howard was alone, sipping brandy in his study, before he struck. Samuel made him confess. He forced Howard to admit his role in ignoring exculpatory evidence, in coaching witnesses to deliver the narrative the prosecution wanted. He made him beg for mercy. Then he gave him the same twisted mercy Howard had once given Samuel, a sentence delivered with finality. When they found Howard's body, his mouth was stuffed with torn pages from his own trial transcript, his verdict scrawled on the walls in his own handwriting. Next was Paula Grady, a social worker who had testified that Samuel was unfit for release and needed permanent care. She had never even spoken to him outside her polished reports. Paula lived in a quiet neighborhood with her husband and young son. Samuel knew that her family was innocent, but her guilt was hers alone to bear. He abducted her from her office parking lot, drugged her, and brought her to an abandoned shelter. He made sure she woke up alone, shackled, disoriented. The recordings of her own testimony played on repeat, cold, clinical statements about his supposed instability. He starved her, kept the lights blindingly bright for days, blasted sirens at random intervals until she was sobbing and incoherent. Then, as she begged for release, he revealed his face. He made her write a full confession, every lie she'd told, every report she'd doctored. When she finished, he ended her life with chilling calmness, leaving her body at the foot of the courthouse steps, her confession clutched in her lifeless hands. By now, news outlets were calling him a vigilante, a ghost, a nightmare come to life. The public was divided. Some saw the pattern and quietly admired the precision of his revenge, while others feared the unknown hand that had turned their justice system into a bloodbath. But no one suspected Samuel. His face was altered, his records scrubbed clean. He was invisible, a phantom driven by the fire of injustice. His final target was Richard Klein, the slick attorney who had orchestrated the entire frame-up. Richard was the puppet master, the one who had coordinated the witnesses, paid off the officials, and sealed Samuel's fate. Samuel saved him for last. Richard was a creature of habit, lavish parties, exclusive clubs, expensive restaurants. Samuel shadowed him, waiting for the perfect moment. It came on a cold autumn night, when Richard left a charity gala alone. Slipping into his chauffeured car, Samuel hijacked the vehicle, knocking the driver unconscious and taking the wheel. Richard woke to find himself bound in the back seat, the city lights blurring past. Samuel brought him to a remote warehouse, one he had prepared meticulously. Inside, he recreated the courtroom. A makeshift judge's bench, witness stands, even a jury of mannequins dressed in tattered suits. Richard was forced to sit in the defendant's chair, his hands bound, as Samuel laid out every piece of evidence, every betrayal. Recordings played of Richard coaching witnesses, authorizing payments, laughing about Samuel's conviction. Richard's terror was palpable, his voice cracking as he pleaded, but Samuel's face was expressionless. He passed sentence with deliberate finality, delivering the same words Richard had once spoken to him. Then, with a precision that mirrored the pain Samuel had endured, he ended him. The warehouse was set ablaze, erasing the scene, leaving only whispers and ash. By the time investigators found Richard's charred remains, the message was clear. This wasn't random violence, it was retribution, calculated and merciless. Samuel watched the city from the shadows, the flames painting the night sky. His list was complete. The people who had stolen his life had tasted the same torment they'd inflicted on him. He had delivered justice in a way the system never could. But his journey wasn't over yet. The city's skyline gleamed coldly beneath a slate-gray sky as Samuel Price sat in the silence of his apartment. It was nearly empty now. Just a fold-out chair, a battered desk, and the board on the wall covered in photos, maps, and strings connecting them all. The names were all crossed out, their faces marked in thick black ink. Dennis Clark, Linda Monroe, Alan Bishop, Kendra Hale, Howard Beck, Paula Grady, Richard Klein. All gone. The weight of years spent in the psychiatric ward, the slow rot of injustice, and the methodical revenge he'd exacted pressed against his chest. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Samuel could breathe. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was done. In the final weeks, whispers of his crusade had spread like wildfire. Some called him a monster, a vigilante who brought terror to the guilty. Others, in hushed tones, spoke of him as a twisted kind of hero, a man who had forced justice down the throats of the corrupt. But none of them truly knew him. They didn't see the years he'd spent screaming behind locked doors, the nights he'd clawed at the padded walls, the moments he'd wanted to end it all. Now he was standing, whole in a way he hadn't been in years. He left his apartment without looking back. There was nothing to return to. He moved through the city unnoticed, his figure blending with the gray crowds, his footsteps silent on the cracked concrete. His destination was the old courthouse, the place where his fate had been sealed so long ago. It was empty now, condemned for demolition, its grand steps cracked and littered with debris. Samuel stood at the base, staring up at the crumbling facade, the broken windows like the eyes of a corpse. He climbed the steps slowly, his breath measured. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the remnants of once grand halls echoing with his footsteps. He reached the courtroom where it had all begun, where the false witnesses and twisted evidence had crushed him beneath the gavel. He stood at the center of the room, his arms at his sides, and closed his eyes. For a long moment there was only silence. Then he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "You thought you broke me. You thought you could bury me with your lies and your greed. But I'm still here, and you're gone." His words didn't echo. They settled into the air like dust. He pulled from his pocket a small bundle of photographs. They were of his sister, Rachel, smiling, her face bright with life. Samuel's hand trembled slightly as he placed them on the judge's bench, a quiet offering to the memory of the person he'd loved most. "I couldn't save you," he whispered, "but I made them pay." His lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment the weight of everything, the lost years, the stolen life, the blood he'd spilled, settled on his shoulders like a shroud. But he didn't flinch. He accepted it. It was his burden, his choice. As he turned to leave, the sound of a creaking floorboard made him pause. But it wasn't an intruder. It was just the building settling into itself, groaning under its own weight. Samuel took it as a sign. It was time to go. He stepped into the light of the afternoon, his figure casting a long shadow across the cracked pavement. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. His work was done, the scales balanced. In the days that followed, news outlets buzzed with speculation about the string of deaths. They painted Samuel as a dangerous predator, a remorseless killer. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't understand the years of torment, the stolen life, the twisted mockery of justice that had left him no choice. The city moved on. The buildings were repaired, the stories faded into background noise, and the names of his victims became footnotes in a corrupted history. But Samuel didn't fade. He wasn't a ghost haunting the past. He was a man walking forward, silent and unseen. He crossed state lines, moving through small towns where no one recognized his face. He found work repairing broken things, old houses, forgotten machines, rusted fences. He liked fixing what was broken. It was simple, honest work. It was a kind of peace. At night, he sat by the window of a modest room in a rundown motel, staring at the stars. He didn't think about the past. He didn't plan for the future. He just breathed, one breath after another, the way he hadn't been able to for years. For the first time in his life, Samuel Price was free. No more chains, no more lies, no more ghosts. Just a man, walking forward into the quiet dark. And this time, no one could take it from him.